The winter of 1883 came down on the Dakota plains like a hammer. It was not a gentle descent into slumber, but a violent, sudden assault. The sky, which had been a placid blue only weeks before, turned to a sheet of hammered iron, gray and unyielding. The wind arrived first, a scout for the army of cold that followed. It was a wind born in the Arctic, a thing with no warmth in its memory, and it scoured the landscape, stripping the last stubborn leaves from the cottonwoods and turning the tall prairie grass into a brittle, whispering sea of gold. The cold did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the thickest logs, found the smallest cracks in the daubing, and crept across the floors of the settlers' cabins like a thief. It was a living entity, a predator, and its prey was warmth. In the small, hopeful settlement of Providence, the fight against this predator was a daily, losing battle. The cabins were built as they had always been built, according to the hard-won wisdom of the frontier. Thick logs, felled from the riverbanks, were notched and stacked. The gaps were chinked with a mixture of mud, moss, and grass. A great stone fireplace stood at one end of the single room, its chimney a column of river rock and clay reaching for the unforgiving sky. This was the heart of the home, the altar upon which the settlers sacrificed their dwindling supply of firewood. The fire was never allowed to die. All day and all night it roared, a hungry beast that demanded constant feeding. Yet it was not enough. The heat it produced was a raw, aggressive thing. It scorched the faces of those who sat too close, while leaving their backs to the mercy of the drafts that sliced through the room like knives. The warmth rose, collecting uselessly against the sod roof, while the floor remained a perpetual sheet of ice. In the mornings, the water in the bucket was always frozen solid. Frost painted delicate, cruel ferns on the inside of the window panes, and even crept along the walls farthest from the hearth. The men chopped wood until their hands were raw and their backs screamed in protest. The women stuffed rags into every new crack the cold pried open. The children lived in a small orbit around the fire, wrapped in every blanket and quilt the family owned. They were surviving, but just barely. It was a siege, and the enemy was winning. The community struggled as one. They shared what little they had and offered words of encouragement, but no one had a solution. This was simply the price of their ambition, the toll demanded by this vast, empty land. They followed the old ways because the old ways were all they knew. To deviate was to court disaster, to gamble with the lives of one's family. Every cabin in Providence was a testament to this shared belief, a near identical copy of its neighbor, each one fighting the same fight, and each one slowly, inexorably losing. The smoke that rose from their chimneys was a signal of defiance, but it was also a confession. It was the color of surrender, a gray plume of precious heat given up to the hostile sky, wasted. Among them lived a man named Elias Thorne. He was a quiet man, made quieter by the things he had seen in the war. He had come to Providence not for glory or for wealth, but for the silence. He had brought with him his wife, Elspeth, and their two small children, a boy and a girl, whose laughter was the only music he now cared for. He was not a large man, and he did not speak with the booming confidence of the other settlers. They saw him as a dreamer, a man whose hands were better suited to holding a book than an axe. He had built his cabin with the rest of them, but he had been slower, more deliberate, and his quiet methods were often mistaken for incompetence. He was an outsider, not by birth, but by nature. He observed more than he spoke, and his gaze seemed to see things that others missed. The way the wind curled around a corner, the way the frost formed patterns, the way the heat shimmered and vanished above a fire. While other men spent the autumn splitting endless cords of oak and cottonwood, Elias spent his days doing something that, to the rest of Providence, looked like madness. He was not building a taller chimney or a thicker wall. He was digging. With a shovel and a pick, he carved long, shallow trenches into the earth around his small cabin, mapping out a strange, web-like pattern that made no sense to anyone. He worked with a focused intensity, his movements economical and precise. He was not just digging, he was shaping the land to a purpose only he understood. He had spent the summer not just farming, but also by the creek bed, working with the heavy clay. He had built a makeshift kiln and fired hundreds of short, wide clay pipes, stacking them carefully near his foundation. One afternoon, a man named Jedediah, the settlement's most respected builder, stopped by Elias's plot of land. Jedediah was a practical man, a man whose hands had raised half the structures in Providence. He saw the world in straight lines and right angles. He looked at the strange, curving trenches and the stacks of crude pipes, and he shook his head, a frown creasing his weathered face. "Elias," he said, his voice a low rumble of concern, "what is this foolishness? The ground will freeze solid in a month. You're wasting time that should be spent on firewood. Your family will suffer for this." Elias paused, leaning on his shovel. He looked at the trenches, then back at Jedediah. "A fire gives off more than just light," he said, his voice soft. "It gives off smoke, and smoke is heat. We throw it away." Jedediah stared, uncomprehending. "Of course we do. It would kill us otherwise. That's what a chimney is for." Elias shook his head gently. "A chimney is a hole in the roof," he replied. "It lets the warmth out and the cold in. I'm building a different kind of chimney." He pointed with his shovel. "The fire will be here," he indicated a deep pit near the cabin wall. "But the smoke will not go up. It will go sideways, through the pipes, under the floor." Jedediah's frown deepened into a scowl of disbelief. "Under the floor? You'll fill your house with smoke. You'll choke your own children in their beds. It's the most dangerous, idiotic thing I've ever heard." He spat on the ground. "Build a proper hearth, man, before it's too late." The story of Elias's dirt pipe foolishness spread through Providence like a prairie fire. It became a source of grim amusement, a cautionary tale told over meager suppers in freezing cabins. Men would laugh as they sharpened their axes. "Heard Elias is planning to warm his house with poison gas," one might say. Another would add, "He's burying his chimney, thinks heat travels downhill." The children, sensing the adults' ridicule, took to calling him Smoky Elias. The women looked at Elspeth with pity, certain she and her children were doomed by her husband's strange obsession. They offered her extra blankets, a silent gesture that spoke of their certainty that her home would soon be a tomb of ice, or worse, a suffocating trap. Through it all, Elias said nothing. He simply continued his work. He worked alone, from the first thin light of dawn until the last rays of sun bled from the sky. The mockery of his neighbors was a distant noise, like the cawing of crows. It did not touch the quiet certainty in his mind. He had seen a version of this work before, in a book of old designs, diagrams of Roman villas heated by systems they called hypocausts. He had seen the principle at work in field hospitals during the war, where surgeons had devised clever ways to warm tents for the wounded. Heat, he knew, was a form of energy. It could be stored. It could be guided. It did not have to be thrown away. His work was a meditation, a physical manifestation of this belief. The digging was the hardest part. The prairie soil was dense, a stubborn web of ancient roots and embedded stones. His shovel struck rocks with a jarring clang that vibrated up his arms and into his teeth. He dug methodically, his trenches perfectly graded, sloping gently away from the firebox and then back towards a single exit point some 20 feet from the cabin. This was the most crucial detail. The smoke heavy with heat, would be drawn through the subterranean network, its warmth leaching into the surrounding earth, before the cooled air was expelled harmlessly away from the house. He was not burying a chimney. He was building a lung for his home, a system to breathe in fire and exhale life-giving warmth. He laid each clay pipe with the care of a jeweler setting a stone. He sealed the joints with a thick slurry of clay and sand, smoothing it with his calloused fingers until each connection was perfect, airtight. This was a slow, painstaking process. A single leaky joint could ruin the entire system, allowing smoke to seep into the ground and eventually into the cabin. He worked with a quiet diligence that baffled those who watched him. While they were engaged in a frantic race against the coming winter, Elias moved with a calm, unhurried rhythm. He was not fighting the season. He was preparing for it, creating a partnership with the very earth his neighbors saw only as a cold, dead thing. While Elias labored over his trenches and pipes, the rest of Providence bustled with the familiar activities of winter preparation. Jedediah and the other men worked in teams, falling back on their trusted methods. They added another layer of mud and moss to their cabin walls, banking sod high against the foundations to block the wind. They spent their days in the dwindling stands of timber along the river, the sharp ring of their axes echoing in the cold, clear air. Great stacks of wood grew beside each cabin, monuments to their hard work and their deep-seated fear. They looked over at Elias, alone in his field of dirt, and shook their heads. They saw a man squandering precious time on a fantasy, a fool digging his family's grave while claiming to build a home. Their own work was fast, efficient, and proven. A log cabin with a big fireplace had kept their fathers and their grandfathers alive. It would keep them alive, too. Elias ignored them. He was focused on the details of his innovation. The firebox was not a wide, open hearth designed for roaring fires. It was a deep, stone-lined pit, almost like a small well, with a heavy iron plate for a lid. It was designed for a slow, smoldering burn that would produce a steady stream of hot smoke, rather than a quick burst of flame. The floor of his cabin was not made of rough-hewn planks that let the cold seep up from below. Instead, he laid a thick bed of sand over his network of pipes, and on top of that, a floor of smooth, flat river stones and packed clay. It was a massive, solid surface, connected directly to the heating system beneath it. The floor itself was to become the radiator, a huge, gentle source of warmth that would heat the entire room evenly. He was building a thermal battery. The immense mass of the earth beneath his cabin, and the stone and clay of the floor, would absorb the heat from the smoke passing through the pipes. It would take a long time to warm up, he knew that. But once it was warm, it would hold that heat for days, releasing it slowly and steadily, long after the fire in the pit had been reduced to embers. His cabin would not be subject to the violent swings of temperature that plagued the others. There would be no scorching heat near the fire and no icy corners. There would only be a constant, pervasive warmth rising from the very ground they walked on. This was the principle he was staking his family's survival on. It was a silent, elegant solution, a stark contrast to the brute force methods of his neighbors. By the time the first snow fell, a thin white veil that promised worse to come, Elias had finished. From the outside, his cabin looked much like any other, save for one glaring omission. It had no chimney. There was no column of stone rising from the roof. Instead, a small, unobtrusive clay pipe, no bigger than a stovepipe, stuck out of the ground some distance from the house, capped with a piece of tin to keep the snow out. It looked forlorn and ridiculous. The first fire he lit was small, a test. He and Elspeth watched with held breath, not for flames, but for the faintest wisp of smoke from the distant pipe. When it finally appeared, a thin, gray tendril rising into the cold air, they both let out a sigh of relief. It worked. The draft was pulling. The first step was a success. The great storm arrived in the second week of December. It did not come with the bluster of a normal blizzard. It crept in overnight, a silent, white beast that swallowed the world. The settlers of Providence awoke to a changed landscape. The sky was gone, replaced by a churning, endless cascade of snow. The wind, which had been a nuisance before, now became a malevolent force. It howled like a starving wolf, a constant high-pitched scream that frayed the nerves and chilled the soul. It slammed into the cabins with the force of a physical blow, probing every wall, searching for any weakness. The temperature plummeted, dropping to depths the settlers had never experienced. It was a cold that was not just an absence of heat, but a presence of its own, a palpable weight that pressed in from all sides. Inside the traditional cabins, the battle for survival became desperate. The great stone fireplaces, once a symbol of comfort, now became tyrants. They devoured wood at an astonishing rate. Men who had thought their woodpiles would last until March now saw them shrinking with terrifying speed. They had to venture out into the blinding, shrieking storm to fetch more logs, returning encrusted in ice, their lungs burning from the frozen air. Despite the roaring fires, the cabins grew colder. The wind forced its way through the chinking, peeling it away in frozen chunks. It created drafts that were no longer mere annoyances, but tangible threats, capable of extinguishing a candle from across the room. In Jedediah's cabin, the mood was grim. He had the largest fireplace and the thickest walls in Providence, yet his home was failing. His wife and children were huddled together on the hearthstones, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces illuminated by a fire that seemed to offer no warmth beyond its immediate reach. The far corners of the room were shrouded in a frigid gloom. A layer of ice, thick as a finger, coated the inside of the door. The logs in the fireplace cracked and popped, shooting sparks into the room, but the sound was swallowed by the monolithic roar of the wind. Jedediah stood, his face a mask of exhaustion and fear, feeding log after log into the fire. He was shoveling fuel into a furnace that was open to the sky. He was losing. He was wrong. Meanwhile, in Elias Thorne's home, there was quiet. There was calm. The storm raged outside, its voice a distant, muffled complaint. The wind battered the walls, but inside, the air was still. There were no drafts. The fire in the deep pit by the wall was not a roaring inferno. It was a small, steady bed of coals, banked low and burning with an almost lazy efficiency. Elias had not been outside to fetch wood since the storm began. A small pile beside the fire pit seemed barely diminished. The true marvel, however, was not the fire. It was the floor. The entire surface of packed clay and stone radiated a gentle, pervasive warmth. It was a heat you could feel through the soles of your boots, a comforting presence that filled the entire space. His children were not huddled by the fire. They were playing on a blanket in the middle of the room, their movements free and unencumbered by layers of heavy wool. Elspeth sat at the small wooden table, mending a shirt, her fingers nimble and sure. The air was not hot or stuffy. It was simply comfortable. The frost that painted the windows of every other cabin in Providence was absent here. The water in the bucket was liquid. The warmth was an even, silent, and absolute fact. Elias's creation was being tested by the worst nature could muster, and it was holding. The principles he had trusted, the quiet wisdom he had followed against all mockery, were proving to be true. The house was not just a shelter. It was a system, a living thing, breathing in the cold and breathing out a steady, life-sustaining warmth. The contrast was absolute. In Jedediah's cabin, a family was in a desperate fight, burning through 3 cords of wood to maintain a temperature that hovered just above freezing. They were cold, frightened, and exhausted. In Elias's cabin, a family was at peace, using less than half a cord of wood to live in a room that was a steady 60 degrees. They were warm, safe, and calm. One home was a frantic battleground of roaring flames and icy drafts. The other was a sanctuary of quiet, radiant heat. The storm outside made no distinction between the 2 houses, but the ideas within them created 2 entirely different worlds. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, Jedediah's woodpile was nearly gone. The temperature inside his cabin had dropped to the point of being dangerous. His youngest child had a cough that rattled in his small chest, and his wife's face was pale with fear. He knew he could not last another night. Swallowing his pride, a thing that felt as bitter and cold as the air he was breathing, he bundled himself in every layer he owned and plunged into the storm. He had to get to Elias's home. He did not know what he would find. He half expected to see them frozen, victims of the smoke he had been so sure would kill them. But he had to check. It was a last, desperate hope. The journey was a nightmare. The snow was waist-deep, and the wind was a solid wall that stole his breath and tore at his clothes. He could not see more than a few feet in front of him. He navigated by memory, a ghost struggling through a white hell. When he finally stumbled against Elias's cabin, he was near collapse, his beard a solid mass of ice. He hammered on the door with a frozen fist, shouting against the roar of the wind. When the door opened, he fell inside, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of snow and misery. And then he felt it. It was not a blast of hot air. It was not the scorching heat of a fireplace. It was a profound, bone-deep warmth that seemed to rise up from the floor and envelop him completely. It was calm. It was steady. It was everywhere. He pushed himself up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He saw Elias's children playing. He saw Elspeth looking at him with concern, not triumph. He saw Elias, his face calm, closing the door against the storm. There was no smoke. The air was clear and fresh, and it was warm. Warmer and more comfortable than his own home had been, even on the mildest day of winter. He looked around the simple, single room, and he understood. He had come expecting to find a tomb, and instead he had found a miracle. Elias did not say, "I told you so." He did not boast or gloat. His quiet triumph was evident in the serene warmth of the room, in the healthy faces of his wife and children. He simply helped the frozen man to his feet and guided him to a chair. Elspeth brought him a cup of hot broth, her movements full of a simple, unstated grace. Jedediah sat there, shivering not from the cold, but from the shock of his own ignorance. He looked at the small, glowing fire pit, then at the warm, solid floor beneath his feet. He had spent his life building things, priding himself on his knowledge of wood and stone and weather. He was the master builder of Providence. And in this small, quiet cabin, he realized he knew nothing at all. The warmth that filled the room was not just physical. It was the warmth of a profound and humbling lesson. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the world was silent, buried under a thick blanket of white. The sun was a pale, watery disk in a clean, cold sky. Jedediah, after recovering in the impossible warmth of Elias's home, made his way back to his own cabin. The first thing he did was check on his family, who had survived by burning furniture after the firewood ran out. The second thing he did was gather the other men. He led them, a small, grim procession of doubters, through the deep snow to Elias's property. They shuffled their feet, their faces a mixture of curiosity and lingering skepticism. They still expected a trick. Elias met them at the door. He did not invite them in right away. He simply stood there, waiting. Jedediah was the one who spoke, his voice hoarse. "They need to see," he said, gesturing to the other men. Elias nodded and stepped aside. One by one, the settlers of Providence entered the small cabin. The effect was the same on every man. They would stop just inside the door, their bodies reacting first to the wave of gentle, uniform warmth. Their eyes would widen. They would look from the small, efficient fire to the children playing happily on the floor. They would touch the walls, expecting to feel the biting cold of the outdoors, but finding them only cool, not frozen. They would stomp their boots on the stone floor and feel the heat radiating up into their legs. The laughter that had followed Elias for months died in that room. It was replaced by a heavy, astonished silence. Jedediah was the first to break it. He walked to the center of the room and looked at Elias, his eyes filled with a respect that bordered on awe. He was a proud man, but he was not a fool. He had seen proof, and it was undeniable. "I was wrong," he said, the words clear and loud in the quiet room. "We were all wrong." He turned to the other men. This is the future. This is how we survive here." He then turned back to Elias, and his voice dropped, becoming the humble plea of a student to a master. "Teach me," he said. "Teach us all." And so Elias shared his knowledge. He did not ask for payment or praise. He sought no title and claimed no special wisdom. He simply explained the principles as he understood them. He took them outside and showed them the network of trenches, now hidden beneath the snow. He drew diagrams in the frost on the window pane, showing them how the hot smoke must be drawn slowly through the pipes, allowing its heat to be absorbed by the surrounding thermal mass. He explained that the goal was not a big fire, but a slow, constant one. He answered their questions patiently, explaining the importance of the sealed joints, the correct grade of the pipes, and the function of the distant exhaust flue. He gave his idea away freely, as a gift. That spring, the settlement of Providence was transformed. The sound of axes still rang out, but it was now joined by the rhythmic scrape and thud of shovels. In every yard, men were digging trenches, following the patterns Elias had shown them. Jedediah worked the hardest of all, his pride channeled into a fierce determination to master this new craft. He was Elias's most dedicated student, asking questions, measuring angles, and ensuring that every detail was perfect. The landscape of the community began to change. The tall, inefficient stone chimneys that had been a source of pride were now seen as monuments to a past ignorance. The new homes, and the retrofitted old ones, were heated from the earth up. The story of the flueless farmhouse and the quiet veteran who had tamed the Dakota winter spread. Travelers and traders who passed through Providence were amazed by the comfort of the cabins. They had never felt anything like it. They would sit in a home with no visible fire, yet feel a pervasive, gentle warmth that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They took the story and the principles of the design with them to other settlements. The idea traveled down rivers and across prairies, carried by word of mouth. It was adopted, modified, and improved upon, becoming part of the unwritten lore of the frontier. It was not a revolution of politics or power, but a quiet revolution of common sense, a slow, steady victory over the cold. Years later, long after the harsh winters had carved deep lines into the faces of the settlers, the lesson of Elias Thorne's ingenuity remained. His children grew up in a home that was always warm, and they took for granted the simple, elegant system beneath their feet. Elias himself remained a quiet man, content to watch his idea take root and flourish. He never spoke of the mockery he had endured, and he never held it against his neighbors. He had not set out to prove them wrong. He had set out to keep his children safe. His vindication was not in their apology, but in the sight of smoke rising from low pipes all across the settlement on a cold winter's morning, a sign that every family was warm, every child was safe. The true legacy was not the design of the hearth, but the humility it had taught them. It was a reminder that the harshest environments are sometimes conquered not by swinging an axe with greater force, but by listening quietly to the whispers of a new idea, and by having the courage to dig in the dirt when everyone else is staring at the sky. The wisdom Elias brought to Providence was about more than just heat. It was about understanding the world differently. Where others saw a simple choice between a big fire and freezing, he saw a system of energy to be managed. Where they saw smoke as a toxic waste product to be expelled as quickly as possible, he saw it as a carrier of precious warmth, a resource to be harvested. This shift in perspective was more profound than any new tool or technique. It was the understanding that survival often depends not on resisting nature, but on working with its fundamental principles. The earth itself, which they had seen only as a cold and hostile foundation, became their greatest ally, a vast, warm blanket waiting to be activated. This lesson, paid for by one man's quiet diligence and the community's humbling winter of crisis, became the bedrock upon which Providence was truly built. If this story reminded you of the power of quiet wisdom and patient innovation, share it with someone who believes in looking for a better way to do things. And follow for more historical stories of courage, survival, and ingenuity.